Hello and welcome to another episode of the SumerSports Show. I'm your host, Parker Fleming, and we're here on a Friday, looping the music again. I apologize, everyone. You're probably hearing that twice. There we go. But we're here on a Friday for a special episode. Instead of Eric doing his week in recap, we do have a special treat here. We have Scott Nestler, the Director of Research and Development at SumerSports on. He's going to talk about some of his recent projects, some of his work, and some exciting things that he's done. We're certainly glad to have him here, and should be a fun little conversation. Scott, thanks for being on this afternoon. How are you, man?
I'm good. Thanks, Parker. Happy you reached out and asked me to come chat with you.
Yeah, well, it's been fun this summer. I'll tell you, we've had Adam Vonderhaar, Quinn McLean, Sean Syed was on Wednesday. There's a deep crew of smart and interesting people that work at Sumer, and I feel very fortunate that I get to interview them all summer and kind of show off some of the stuff we have going on here. Scott, before we get into the interview and start talking about your work and some of the interesting articles you've written, I will do just a little bit of housekeeping and say, make sure you're following SumerSports, basically anywhere there's social media. I think we have a Threads account now, if that's your thing. So you can get over there and follow them, on YouTube, rate, review the show, help us share it, get it to people who think it's interesting and would benefit from it. And, make sure that you sign up with your email at sumersports.com/thezone. That's the -zone. That's where all of our articles and content are hosted. Articles much like the series that Scott has written recently on decision science that we will talk about this afternoon. So, Scott, tell people a little bit about you and kind of your position at Sumer, and then I'll kind of ask you how you got into sports analytics. But let's start with the present first.
Yeah, so at a high level, I consider myself to be a pracademic, which is a portmanteau of practitioner and academic, because I like solving, real world problems and also teaching. My role at Sumer, I was hired on about a year ago as a principal data scientist. After a few months, I moved into a role as the optimization lead, and then more recently became director of research and development. I've done work on a variety of models at Sumer. Our grade projection model, or aging curves, as you might call them. A lot of work on the optimization that was at the heart of our initial draft dashboard. And more recently, I've been working on a wins above replacement, or a WAR model, fitting for a former Army guy, I figure. And then, also doing a little bit of work incorporating large language models into our offerings.
There are multiple things to be excited about at Sumer with what we're working on, and you do have your hands in a lot of those very exciting things. That's the language model stuff, man. I don't know about you, but that gets my blood pumping a little bit. I'm very excited about the possibilities there. I think that's really fun, and we have a smart team working on it, certainly. How did you get into sports analytics at all, Scott? What was your background? When did you decide, hey, I'm interested in, maybe pursuing the analytics and math sort of things from a career perspective, and kind of how did you get here?
Yeah, so I was a career Army officer. I spent 25 years in the United States Army, and during that time, besides doing cool things like working with a missile system, I got to go to graduate school a couple of times, served on the faculty at West Point and the Naval Postgraduate School, and I did some other performance analytics work that translates fairly directly over to sports. If you think about measuring the performance of soldiers in the physical, the cognitive, and the moral domains, that's kind of like a lot of what we do at Sumer. So that was kind of the background that sort of got me interested in it. And when I retired in 2015 and took a job teaching at Notre Dame, where I was full-time for 6 years, one of the things that hooked me actually to take that job versus some other offers was they said, hey, we've been wanting somebody to teach a sports analytics class. Are you interested? And I was like, well, where do I sign? So I started teaching sports analytics and was the advisor for the sports analytics club at Notre Dame during my time there, worked with 7 different teams on campus. And so that's kind of how I got into it.
Awesome. Yeah, it sounds like a lot of us where we had, careers and the sports just kind of said, hey, I'm interested in it. Maybe I can apply this, and the opportunity arose, and they were able to kind of run with it. So that's really, really cool. And I think one thing I want to highlight before we get to the decision science articles that you wrote, and I want to talk about is is this book that's just come out that you have helped revise and written a new edition for, Mathletics, the updated version. I believe this is 2.0. Of course, I got a lot of my start in sports analytics by going chapter by chapter in Wayne Winston's original version or first version and just replicating things. So tell me a little bit about these, getting to how you got involved in working on the update of Mathletics, and kind of how that project has been.
Yeah, sure. So, you mentioned the first edition, which looks like this. Came out in like 2009 in hardback, 2011 in paperback, and great book. And like you, I went through it chapter by chapter, working through all the Excel workbooks and everything, and thought it was great. And when I started teaching at Notre Dame, I was thinking, well, what can I use as a textbook? And I thought it was the best choice out there. So I used it as my textbook. Plus, it's very reasonably priced. And at the end of the semester, I asked the students, so what'd you think? And they were like, well, it's good, but it's kind of dated. There's some players in there who aren't playing anymore, but they aren't like all-time greats either. And, it'd be better if it had more updated data. Well, in the Army, I had taken a short course. I think it was in optimization from Wayne Winston, like a decade or so before that. So I reached out to him and said, hey, Wayne, I just taught a class using your book, your Mathletics book. That's one of many books he's put out. And I said, my students liked it, but we're asking me if it's possible to get an updated version. Do you have any plans to do that? And he was like, I'm kind of moving into an emeritus status. Not really sure that's in the cards. I said, okay, let me rephrase that question. If you had a, slightly younger co-author who had students available to pull data, would you be interested in putting out a revised, expanded, updated edition? And he said, keep talking. And well, before we knew it, we had a contract signed, and that was that. And then I got a little overcommitted, and we brought in Kostas Pellikrinis, who's a faculty member at Pitt, to help push us across the line. And they've both been great to work with on the project. So now we do have the second edition. If you do get this, make sure you get the yellow one, from 2022, not the older one. Not that there's anything wrong with it, but this one does have like 10 new chapters, 200 new pages, and a GitHub repository to support it.
Yeah, the GitHub repository is super interesting, and I'll kind of lead into the question I'm going to ask after this. I will just plug. I do believe that I've seen, and I might mess up the pronunciation totally, but Konstantinos has the slides, Winning Sports with Data, that are an excellent resource for anyone. Again, Scott, that is the number one question I have in my DMs is, hey, how do I get started? Hey, I took some data science courses. How do I get into this? And that would be a great. Winning Sports with Data is a great online course, tons of replicable code, a lot of examples from a lot of different sports that I'm sure vibe very, very well with the Mathletics as well, and would be a nice supplement and complement to having that. Yes, so GitHub, so GitHub repo, there's Bayes involved, there's some Calcutta stuff in here. The updates sound very interesting. You hinted a little bit that maybe it seemed a little outdated. How did you guys decide where to go with the update? I mean, sports and data is such a big subject now. How did you decide what to put into the new version?
Yeah, a combination of things. I mean, the first version focused primarily on the big three sports of baseball, football, and basketball, which, at that time were kind of the only places much was really being done, and maybe not much in some cases. But so we added some additional sports, soccer, hockey, volleyball, golf, esports. We added a bunch of chapters that were kind of sports focused. But then if you think about the changes that happened from 2010 to, closer to 2020, the use of tracking data, initially in basketball, baseball, then in football, collecting data from the web and via APIs. I mean, that wasn't around really in 2010. You mentioned Bayesian models, network analysis. We just kind of said, okay, well, let's try to keep it, sort of the same as it is, update the data in those chapters that are still going to exist, and then add new ones in areas that we think people would want to read about.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting. You even have chapters on camera data, which kind of the tracking data is just absolutely the future of where a lot of this teams and stuff are going. So a really interesting. Really interesting book. And what I loved about the first edition was how well it scaled, and just saying, if you know a lot about sports, this is still good for you. If you don't know a lot about sports, this is still a good entry point into learning about sports and learning how to think about how to use analytics in sports, which is, of course, equally as important, if not more important than, the physical tools for how to do that. Is that fair to say this is this is a book kind of for sports aficionados, people who are already working in sports analytics, or people who want to work in sports analytics?
Yeah, I think so. But I mean, the casual reader can read it as well and maybe just not do some of the mathematical exercises. So I think it has broad appeal. I believe Wayne has said that what he's been told from Princeton University Press, our publisher, is that it's the best-selling sports analytics book with equations in it. I think Moneyball has certainly sold more copies. Of course, that's more of just a storyline, but I think it has broad appeal. And when we reached out to them about putting out a second edition, we weren't sure that they were going to agree to it. We thought they might say, no, that's okay, in which case he was going to ask for the rights back and we would self-publish it. But they said, oh, no, we'd love to. It still sells a couple thousand copies a year, even though it's, going on 10 years old.
Wow, that's incredible. Yeah, I like the caveat with equations in it, but you got to find that line. I think I heard Eric on the podcast a couple months ago mention "How to Gamble If You Must" by Dubins and Savage, and I thought, oh, that's interesting. Let's go read some math and football. And whoof, it's a little dense. It's a little hard to get through. But I feel like the if the second version is anything like the first version, which I'm hoping it is, as my copy is in the mail, is a readable but technical and approachable. So that's a really fun project, a really cool thing. That's awesome you got to work on it, and honestly, a good for the sports analytics community to have again another resource that's updated and a little more cutting edge to kind of evolve as analytics and as sports are moving forward. Speaking of cutting edge, speaking of moving forward, the SumerSports website is putting out some great content right now on the Zone, some articles that are asking questions about how to think about the game. Just this week, our own Sean Syed put out an article about Kyle Shanahan's offense that might be one of the most thorough documentations of that offense that I've seen. Just really great content on there. If you want to hear more about that, you can check out the show from Wednesday. But Scott, you have a series that I think is running all summer and is currently in progress on the on decision science in football, and kind of how do we think about making decisions as it applies to NFL teams, and a couple examples there. So I'd love to talk to you about a couple of these, and just kind of where your thought process came from, and what your insights are in those articles. So first, what is decision science, and how can it help teams tangibly in the NFL today?
Yeah, I consider decision science, and to be clear, I wasn't sure what term I wanted to use here for this set of articles, but that's what I settled on. But I consider it this collection or set of quantitative techniques that you can apply to decision making, whether it be at the individual level or the organizational level. And I think of decision science as including other things like decision analysis, which is a little bit more specific, but also risk analysis, cost benefit analysis, behavioral decision theory. I mean, it can get very broad very quickly. I come from an operations research background, which uses many of these tools and methods as well. And I guess the one thing I like about decision science is that it draws both from math and also from psychology to look at and understand decision making.
Yeah, well, sitting here as Sumer's resident economist at large, as it were, I'm like, yeah, I agree with a lot of those things, and I think it is a good way to kind of use a combination of logic and reasoning, and some formal mathematical models to kind of arrive at a conclusion, knowing the process along the way. I think that I might have this later in our rundown, but I did want to ask about this decision process. Really teaches you to, or excuse me, decision science really teaches you to emphasize the process and not necessarily the outcome. In today's NFL game, that feels invaluable.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the way you judge the quality of a decision is not based upon the outcome, but it's based upon the process you followed, and did you do things that were logical and consistent. Now, you want to see a good outcome, don't get me wrong, and hopefully by following that process, you'll end up with a good outcome, at least, a high percentage of the time. Maybe not every example, but this gets to one of those, well, is this a one-time decision or a repeated decision that we're going to get to make many, many times? And the way you approach it might be different.
Yeah. And that kind of idea of separating luck from luck from certainty and kind of what you can control and can't control is the $1 million question, especially when it comes to aligning the incentives of GMs who are working on a certain time horizon and owners who are working on a different time horizon. And you throw all the uncertainty of the football is an oblong little fickle thing, and it bounces weird, and the weather can be bad, and you can be the Buffalo Bills and get the Cincinnati Bengals at home in a blizzard and think this is great, and still not be able to seal the deal for whatever reason. So certainly an interesting tool to kind of use these, these structured methods to help us look at decisions. So in your first article, you talked about decision trees and backwards induction, and specifically with a kind of kicking or go for it on fourth down framework. Could you explain a little bit about how to think about that decision? Should I go for the fourth down? Should I kick a field goal, or should I punt? Using a kind of decision science framework.
Yeah. So the reason I chose that example is it's been in the popular press a few years, and I thought that readers could easily relate to it, which might make introducing an unfamiliar technical method a little more approachable for them. But generally speaking, the idea is, well, what are the outcomes that could happen? We often think of these as payoffs, but it doesn't necessarily have to be dollars per se. But what in the case of the example that I used, it's, how many expected points or expected points added, might result if I choose to do this. And then I compare the different alternatives. And then if I want to maximize expected points added, which sounds like a good thing to do, then I choose the one, that results in that in expectation, or, most likely to happen. So you're starting kind of with sort of the end in mind, the what could happen, and then you're backing it, towards the present, towards the decision you're trying to make. And the decision trees that I showed were very simple, straightforward ones. Oftentimes they have multiple decision points and uncertainty nodes built into them, but you have to figure out, how do we work in the probabilities of what could happen, and then based upon that, what should I choose to do? But like you said, the whole idea in solving one of these is kind of starting at the end and rolling it back to where you're at today and trying to make a decision.
Yeah, absolutely, and it is almost Bayesian in nature, just starting at the end and kind of moving backwards or moving through the decisions to say, if this happened, well, then what would I have wanted to do? And again, being an economist, very familiar with the game theory and the prisoner's dilemma of, well, I want this option, but it's not there. I can't use that one, and how do I still make the best decision? And we'll talk a little bit about minimizing regret when we talk about your second article here in a second. Yeah. So the example I think you had, which again, relevant and very tangible, kick or go for it, is right on the nose and easily digestible. As we're kind of scaffolding this up empirically, right? We're using this kind of decision science to tackle more complex problems. Can you think of how you can expand the expected value framework for more complex situations in football? Can you think of other use cases kind of outside of the kick it or go for it framework?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of places we could go. There's, working in things like risk preferences, certainty equivalence, utility curves, value functions, and so on. One of the, but I wanted to keep it simple for this first article. I think there might be another article later on that pulls some of that in. One that occurred to me this past week, actually, was, you've probably seen on social media, would you rather have $1 million now or a chance to get $10 million if you could gain 10 yards in an NFL game or score 15 points in an NBA game? Well, you could approach that with a decision tree approach and try to figure out, well, what would the probability have to be to make you want to go for that higher payoff? And then, realistically assess that against what is the probability of, getting 10 yards or scoring 15 points. And I think for most of us, taking the $1 million would make more sense for a couple of reasons. But yeah, I mean, there was one that occurred to me that people probably intuitively use a decision tree approach without thinking of it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Scott, the benefit so much of that is just getting pen to paper. I know that, and I've talked about this on the podcast before, but in the times that I've worked with coaches, there have been a lot of examples where it's I'm not really even offering a lot here. I'm just saying, if you're going to make that decision, can we just document what that means you believe? It's if you think, hey, we shouldn't go for it, we shouldn't go for 2 when we scored or go down 8 at the end of a game, or towards the end of the game. That's fine. Let me just document that this is the implied probability of winning in overtime. This is the probability of converting in a short yard situation, and kind of document all those things together so that you understand what, like, on its own terms, what you're believing. Because I think that's a big issue with football is there are a lot of people who have strong beliefs, but not necessarily have thought through the systems of, like, the implications of those strong beliefs and how all those work together. And then, of course, the general equilibrium framework, nothing to say of, the risk and the uncertainty that comes in as well. So certainly a complex problem and an interesting framework to think about it. Scott, I want to move us and talk about this second article. Before I do that, I don't have the Circa ad read in front of me, but I will just take a minute to say the SumerSports podcast is now presented in part by Circa Sports. We're excited to have them as a partner. It's a sharp book focusing on, thinking about the games and thinking about the lines and really truly making it a game between the books and the bettors. A great place to look. I look at their lines as kind of a baseline for a lot of things that I do, and really respect a lot of the work they're doing. They have a Circa Million sign up and a Circa Survivor NFL pool. You can just go to circa.com and find all of their stuff there about how to play, how to enter. There is a weekend in Vegas where you can go sign up. You can sign up in Vegas. You can play anywhere. And I know that some of us from Sumer will be there at that weekend. So that'll be a lot of fun and exciting to kind of meet some people and see how all that goes. But check out circasports.com. It's a growing book, and they're really trying to do things the right way. And we are happy to be supported in parts of the podcast by the folks over at Circa. Awesome. Okay, Scott. Now, the second article was a little different, still in decision science, still focusing on kind of thinking about how we're thinking, but a little bit of a different angle. You present some alternate strategies to problem solving, some ways to say, let me formally make a decision, and how could I potentially solve them? So before we talk about the specific strategies, could you kind of frame the problem that the decision science and these strategies would solve?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, we often tend to think more is better, which in many cases is true, but that isn't always the case. Think about the way that football teams are, when they're putting together a roster and what they're trying to do. If you ask any owner, any GM, they're going to tell you, yeah, I want to win the Super Bowl. Well, sure, they do on some level, but do they want to win it this year? Do they want to win it in 3 or 4 years? And what decisions are they going to make based upon that, and how might they be different? What you choose to do, partially depends on, what you want to accomplish, but also the timeline on what you want to accomplish it. And, the sort of the decision metric that you use might change depending on that. I mean, some teams who want to go for it this year, yeah, they really do want to maximize the maximum now. Others who are in a rebuilding phase and have more time might want to, just not suck this year. I mean, to put it bluntly, they're like, yeah, we're not going to get there this year, but we just don't want to be too bad and lose our fans and, support and whatnot. And the way in which you approach those objectives is different. So that's what the decision making under uncertainty article attempts to do, is lay out a few different ways we could approach different decisions.
Yeah. And the specific example you have is about a running back. Should I draft him in the first round? Should I draft him in the second round? Should I, what's the probability he's going to be a contributor, be off my roster, and kind of player projection and the future value. And what I think is so interesting and kind of, and one of the more interesting questions in football generally is this conflict between, I know there's a lot of uncertainty, I don't know the outcomes, and even looking back, it's hard to really know the outcomes without, parsing some data and making sure you know what you're looking at. How can we, so in your example, great, very approachable, some specific numbers saying, if this was the real value, this is the real probability, how do we do that? But that interesting question to me is, how do we assign those payoff values to a player? Under uncertainty and knowing decision science? That to me, Scott, seems like the first person who's going to be skeptical about decision science is going to be like, you can't even know what a player's value is. How do you even do that to begin to make this decision?
Yeah, I mean, and this is just one decision. There's lots of examples of decisions under uncertainty. You know, whether or not you can get a player on your roster, how they're going to perform if you do manage to get them on the roster, and then whether they're going to, you know, get injured or decide to retire out of the blue, and so on. But in terms of assigning, you know, payoff values that we could attempt to use with one of these methods that was described in the article, I mean, there's lots of ways to do this. You know, you kind of got to figure out, well, are we talking about points? Are we talking about wins? Are we talking about dollars? It's got to be on a common scale, whatever it is, you know. And what's the time frame? Are we talking like per play, per game, per season? And you know, what are we comparing it to? Is it, you know, average performance, replacement level performance? And you know, depending on your goals and the decision at hand, it could be any combination of those things. And you know, the decision tree methodology, or the sort of methods that I described in this uncertainty article, they aren't going to care as long as it's, you know, consistent across all of the outcomes. And that's the hard part, is getting them consistent oftentimes.
Yeah, absolutely, it is. I did want to highlight and point out in the article, you did point out an example where you know, kind of definitively looking to maximize your floor, the maxi-min. It does work out better than Minimax on the defensive side of the ball. Can you explain why that would be?
I think you mean Maxi Min is better than Maxi Max, actually.
Yes, I think so. I think I have a typo in my notes, but yes, that's you want to Maxi Min instead of Maxi Max.
Maxi Max would be, you want the best, you know, secondary player, but if your other three are pretty bad, that isn't going to help you. In that case, you know, like our colleague Eric has pointed out, you know, defensive secondary is a weak link system where your defense is only as good as the worst player in that unit. In that case, a Maxi Min, in other words, you know, making sure the worst one isn't awful is probably a sound decision.
Yeah. And it's interesting to look at that. I also think about the offensive line, because very clearly, like, the positional value is not standard across the offensive line. But if you have a gaping hole in you know, one position, then it really doesn't matter how good the other positions are, because of how athletic defensive lines are and how much they can stunt. And it is interesting to think about the context of I think that is one way that a kind of casual fan, aspiring sports analyst could get into this really, really well, is starting to think about, what is the objective function here? You know, watching the game and thinking about, okay, what problem are they actually trying to solve? And then how are they solving it? Not just, oh, they got 6 yards on that play, but, you know, even in terms of roster construction, what does a team want their identity to be? Do they think that's going to be successful? And do they execute it? Because that separation and that murkiness, or the lack of separation and the existence of murkiness between execution and intent in football, I think, is not well understood. And something like data, I keep saying data science. Data science definitely helps us with this, but decision science helps us kind of put some framework on that as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So I think this is a series of 3. Am I correct about that? And I don't want to put you on the spot. You don't have to commit to anything. But more articles are coming on decision science.
Yeah, I don't know about 3. I think there may be more than that. I mean, the third one's mostly done. It's actually on multi-criteria decision making, which can take on a few different forms. I mean, you might have multiple objectives that are actually competing with or in conflict with one another. Or it could just be that you have many attributes that you're trying to measure, and then in some way harmonize and pull together, you know, put on a common scale so that you can add them for comparison purposes. And you know, once I get that one finished on the site, maybe we can talk about that some other time. But yeah, I've got ideas for other articles too. So, you know, decision trees are one way to structure decisions, or, you know, at least get you to think about them. There's another tool out there called influence diagrams that I think might be interesting to highlight. Simulation gets used in a lot of cases to deal with uncertainty. Yeah, I have some other ideas as well. We'll see where it goes. I need to get the third one done. Just been busy working on a model, you know, for my day job per se. This is kind of like my part of my writing for the zone is, it's part of my job, but it's more on the side than my main focus. But it's something I enjoy, so I'll do more of it.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, that's great. And I'm certainly looking forward to that. Of course, as you have time, of course, also working at Sumer, yes, spend more time on your main thing and make that great, but certainly looking for great content and enjoyed reading those. We have hit that 30-minute mark and it is a Friday afternoon. So we're going to keep this one a little bit short and tie a bow on it there. Scott Nestler, Director of Research and Development at SumerSports, co-author on the new version of Mathletics and author of a couple interesting pieces and a couple more to come up on SumerSports.com/the zone. Thanks for being here today, Scott. Really enjoyed talking to you.
Thanks for having me, Parker. I had a good time too. Have a good weekend.
You as well. All of you who are watching, thanks for being here. And we'll catch you guys next week with a couple of interesting guests and some more fun content here on the Sumer Sports Show.